My name is Anoush Baghdassarian. I am a recent graduate of Harvard Law School, and in this September, I'll be moving to the Netherlands to work at the International Criminal Court. So it really is a privilege to be here speaking with such giants in this field of genocide and atrocity crime studies. And a real privilege to be here with all of you for justice, accountability, and Artsakh. This panel, as you know, is the study of law and genocide and victims' narratives. And we have three really special guests for you. Each will get an opportunity to speak for 20 minutes, and then we'll open it up for a question and answer session. So if you have a question at any point, please just raise your hand. Someone will come by you, give you a piece of paper and a pen, and we can hand it up to me for the question and answer session. And for the speakers, I will give you a 5-minute and a 1-minute warning for time. So I'll read first the bios with Professor Ocampo first. An incredible honor. He was my professor briefly, and he just is exceptional. Luis Moreno Ocampo was the first prosecutor from June 2003 through June 2012 of the new and permanent International Criminal Court. His office was involved in 20 of the most serious crimes of the 21st century, including Iraq, Korea, Afghanistan, and Palestine. He conducted investigations in 7 different countries, presenting charges against Muammar Gaddafi for crimes against humanity committed in Libya, President of the Sudan, Omar al-Bashir, for genocide in Darfur, the former President of the Ivory Coast, Laurent Gbagbo, Joseph Kony, and the former Vice President of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Jean-Pierre Bemba. Previously, Moreno Ocampo played a crucial role during the transition to democracy in Argentina as the deputy prosecutor in the junta trial in 1985 and the prosecutor in the trial against the military rebellion in 1991. He was a visiting professor at Stanford University and Harvard University. After the end of his tenure as ICC prosecutor, Moreno Ocampo was the chairman of the World Bank expert panel on the Padma Bridge project, and he is now in private practice at a New York law firm. Professor Stanley Goldman is a professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles and the founding director of the Loyola Center for the Study of Law and Genocide. The Center for the Study of Law and Genocide, which couples research and practical advocacy to help victims of genocide achieve justice. It aims to promote legal scholarship on genocide and mass violations of human rights with a particular focus on improving and making more accessible and effective legal resources and remedies, both in the US and internationally. It also seeks to train current and future legal practitioners on using existing remedies to help victims of genocide and mass violations of human rights achieve a measure of justice. It regularly presents the Raphael Lemkin Award to those committed to combating genocide. Prior to joining the faculty at Loyola, Goldman spent 8 years as a deputy Los Angeles County public defender. He tried approximately 70 jury and 300 court trials and has appeared as counsel in every level of federal and California court, including the California and United States Supreme Court. He teaches criminal law, criminal procedure, evidence and the law, and genocide. Elke Heckner teaches in the German department at the University of Iowa. She is currently completing a book manuscript tentatively entitled Memories of Futurity, Remapping Visual Representations of the Holocaust and Genocide. Her recent articles in Shofar and New German Critique examine issues of second and third generation witnessing in film, TV productions, and memorial culture. Her research interests include Holocaust and genocide studies, film and media studies, museum studies, as well as memory and trauma studies. It really is an immense privilege to have all three of you here opening the conference with us. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Professor Ocampo to speak about global narratives and arts to bring awareness to genocide and survivors. Thank you. Let's welcome our panelists with a big round of applause.
Thank you, Anoush. Thank you very much, Anoush, for your introduction. How do you like to play? I have a PowerPoint prepared that I would like to show it.
Oh, 1 second, Professor. We lost your sound. You're muted, it looks like. It looks like you're muted.
Now?
Yes, we hear you now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Look, do you like to, you pass my PowerPoint and I can do it? I should do it. Or you should do it. You can do it.
We have your PowerPoint. It's up.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Okay, thank you very much. I would say if we can multiply Anoush and Emilia for 100, you will solve any problem. They are incredibly active and committed to transform the situation, and that's why I am very glad to be part of this conversation. Yes, you saw, I was involved in massive crimes since 1985 when I was a young guy there facing my generals. And then 30 years later, 20 years later, I became the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court. Since then, go to the next. Since then, I try to think on these issues, how to transform my experience into something useful for people. Anoush, can you move? That's it. So I spent my last 9 years writing this book about war and justice in the 21st century, which is coming. You see, the new wars are different wars. We have the classic Ukraine war we today, but this book is about other wars, like a terrorist attack in New York or drone attacks in Afghanistan. And the time of investigation within the ICC. So it's my memory of the 9 years. And I was trying to understand more, not just the legal aspect. I was trying to transform my experience, describing to lawyers the other factors affecting our work. That's why I was teaching at Harvard after I left. And also now I moved to Los Angeles because I am in a cinematic art school in the USC, one of the I think the best school of movies around the world, because I try to understand the relation between the work of lawyers and how people understand the problems we are dealing with. And go to the next, Anoush. I found the professor Viet Nguyen, is a professor of USC who is from Vietnam, and he says something very meaningful for us, for lawyers. He says all wars are fought twice. The first time on the battlefield, the second time in memory. And I would say my cases are similar. We prosecuted my generals in 1985, but the memory is now the battle. And in fact, this year, Amazon is producing a movie about our trial. And therefore, my kids, my youngest kid, who born after the trials, will learn about what we did through the movies. So the fight for the past is no more in trial, it's in movies and TikTok and in the communication area. And that's the point I like to emphasize today in this conversation, how we can transform the narratives about what happened with the Armenian genocide. So that's the point. This chart shows basically the idea I like to present. Crimes could be investigated and prosecuted, but the relevance of the legal conclusions will be defined by the narratives and the memories. Legal designs influence the narratives because a narrative establishes the memory and the policy for the future. And Armenia case a great example. The use of the word genocide is part of the battle for the memory and for the future of the Armenians. So that idea I like to convey to you. It's not just about legal proceedings, it's about the narratives about legal proceedings. Show the next. Yes. And that idea I would like to present to you and invite to work together with the panelists and the people in conference. How we can develop movies and courses about the Armenian genocide to establish the memory and the policy for the future. Can we create with Anoush and Emilia and maybe American University there and other universities, the professors who are in the panel with me, how create a platform to include and promote courses, films, and social media, including TikTok, about the Armenian genocide and its consequences? That is, for me, the idea I like to promote today. And whoever is interested, talk to Anoush. She is the person who would drive this idea. So that idea. And let's start with this. So this is my first trial. Argentina, 1985. Can you click? No, before you go. Go before? Can you, it's a click. Go, no. Click in the, you can film. No. There. You see?
I think the Junta trial was the first time when I had to face people who was against me. The elite in my country was in favor of the military dictatorship. So I had to face my family.
La ferocidad y la mentira son las dos notas del sistema de represión. Por eso hoy se hace necesario averiguar la verdad y juzgar a todos los que hayan violado la ley, en particular a los poderosos, a los máximos responsables.
So this trial was a big thing in my country and in the world. It was disseminated. I always say I never could convince my mother that General Videla should be prosecuted. My mother she loved General Videla. My grandfather was a general. My mother loved generals. She went to church with General Videla, and she was thinking General Videla was protecting her. And the trial transformed her. So my mother learned about what Videla did in the trial. After the first week, she called me and said, I still love General Videla, but you are right. He has to go to jail. So the meaning of what we did was because my mother read newspapers describing what the witness was saying. And then my mother changed her mind. And go to the next. But the big impact of the Junta trial was that there were a lot of communication about the case. Here you have the report. The Argentina had one of the first Truth Commission who produced a report, and the book is sold more than 2 million books. Then you have a special weekly magazine describing in detail the trial. And then you have 440 films about the problem in Argentina, including 2 that received an Oscar, Official Story and El Secreto de tus Ojos. They received an Oscar. And now, I told you, Tony is producing a new movie about the trial, where an actor will characterize me and the prosecutor of the case. So my case will learn about what happened through the movies. And the meaning of what we did will be defined by the movie. So, and that is for me, one of the lessons I learned. Yes, what we do is important. It's important to present good evidence, analyze the law very well, but the communication will be about movies. Let's go to the next. And professors. Harvard Professor Kathleen Sicking, she was in the Junta trial as auditing, watching it, and then 30 years later, she wrote this book called The Justice Cascade, where she identified in the lower level, you see the laws adopted, including the Genocide Convention, the Geneva Convention, the Apartheid Convention, the Convention Against Torture, in the American Convention on forced disappearance, and then the Rome Statute creating International Criminal Court. So she identified the evolution, legal evolution, but also the enforcement. she identified what she called the justice cascade, where international and national courts investigated the crimes and made responsible, starting with Nuremberg in 1945 and until 48, were the first international courts, following by national court in Greece, Portugal, in particular Argentina in 1985, and then the International Tribunal for Yugoslavia, Rwanda, and then the International Criminal Court. So that is justice cascade, and Argentina became part of that. Go to the next. But all started with Nuremberg. And in fact, the Armenian genocide was part of the discussion to create Nuremberg. The failure to investigate the Armenian genocide was in some way triggered the impetus to do the Nuremberg case. And yes, go ahead, click, show the movie. But we need sound here, so I hope.
For the United States of America.
The privilege of opening the first trial in history for crimes against the peace of the world imposes a grave responsibility. The wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored because it cannot survive their being repeated.
The chief prosecutor is saying that the crimes were so malignant and so devastating that humanity would not survive if they are being repeated. So the chief prosecutor in Nuremberg is not about legal fantasies, it's about survival, humanity survival. That are the words of the chief prosecutor there, who cannot listen. Go next. But after the first Nuremberg trial, there were 12 other trials conducted by American prosecutors and judges. One of them is Einsatzgruppen, trial at Nuremberg. And the prosecutor leader was Ben Ferenc. Let's see if it's working. Ben Ferenc here was 90. He was informing that he was the first prosecutor here, Ben Ferenc in 1946, 27 years old boy, presenting the case of Einsatzgruppen, a group of people who execute Jews, Gypsies, communists in different countries. This is one of the leader of the Einsatzgruppen from southern Ukraine. And this man described this shooting, this killing, and he confessed from June 1941 to June 1942, the Einsatzgruppen groups liquidated. So he confessed before the court that he managed to kill 90,000 people in 1 year. That's the type of documentation that the trial produced. But the impact at Nuremberg was not just the court itself. Go to the next, Anoush. So the word Holocaust changed for movies. In the 50s was Anna Frank movie, but then two important things. The Eichmann show was a TV production taping the Eichmann case in Jerusalem. Eichmann was a SS commander who was responsible to sending millions of Jews to the camps, and they was arrested, abducted, in fact, in Argentina, trial in Jerusalem in 1960, and there was American producers filming the trial and producing like a show that was watched in 27 countries in those days. And the the Eichmann trial ended in 1961, December 1961, the same week that in Berlin, it was premiered a movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. And then in the 70s, there was a miniseries with Meryl Streep called Holocaust. And let me show the impact of that. Go to the next. Yes, this graph shows how the word Holocaust with capital letter, so meaning what happened to the people under the Nazi regime, started to be used in 1961 when the Eichmann trial ended and Judgment at Nuremberg was presented, and was promoted at the end of the 70s by this Meryl Streep miniseries Holocaust, and now it's in stone. So, what is that? So basically, yes, Nuremberg was very important. However, the most important thing were the movies about the problem, and the movies transform the concept. The movies transform the use of the word Holocaust into the name of the conflict, and that is the impact of movies. My last example, go ahead, go to the next. Okay, so here, no sound.
For 45 of the Rome Statute, may I kindly ask you to approach the lectern in order to take the oath. May I ask you to raise your right hand and pledge your solemn undertaking.
Moi, Luis Moreno Ocampo, déclare solennellement que je remplirai mes devoirs et exercerai mes attributions de procureur de la Cour pénale internationale.
You may proceed to sign your declaration and take the seat allocated to you.
So my job in Argentina produced my appointment as the first chief prosecutor of the new and innovative International Criminal Court. And at the end of my tenure, when closing my first trial, I tried to connect the Nuremberg cases with the ICC. Then I invite Ben Ferenc, the lawyer of this Artsakh group and case, to be part of my team. Can you click, Anoush? Oh no, before. Click the before. They click there.
Please,
yes.
Your Honors, this is a historic moment. I am now in my 92nd year, having spent a lifetime striving for a more humane world governed by the rule of law. I am honored to represent
This is the first
prosecutor
trial
telling
at the ICC.
significance of this trial. In Rome, over 100 sovereign states decided that child recruitment were, and I'm quoting now from the statute, among the most serious crimes of concern for the international community as a whole. Vengeance begets vengeance. Seizing and training young people to hate and kill undermines the legal and moral firmament of human society. Let the voice and the verdict of this esteemed global court now speak for the awakened conscience of the world. Thank you.
Yeah. And again, the relevance of the ICC is not just, go ahead, the next, is not just about our case in court. The relevance is how movies, different documentaries, there were 7 documentaries presenting the activity of the court. And Quarantine 2012 was probably the most famous. It became a viral documentary to got 120 million viewers in 6 days. 6 days. So go to the next. So legal design and narratives. Narrative establish the memory and the policy for the future. My proposal today is, go ahead. Next. Oh no. The previous one. That one, that's the end. So this is my proposal. I'd like to continue this conversation, how we can work together to put together movies and courses about the Armenian genocide, to establish the memory and the policy for the future. So Anoush is the person who you contact to do that. She will help us to organize this. And I hope in next year, we can start to show courses and movies, how to discuss the Armenian genocide. That's the plan, that's the proposal. Thank you very much for this invitation.
Thank you so much, Professor Ocampo. Having you here is of itself a huge privilege and honor and incredible moment. And in addition, with all of your experience, hearing about the incredible importance of framing and engaging the public through media and narrative, in addition to law, and all the examples you have from Argentina, how before there was justice, before the repeal of the amnesty laws, there were all these movies and films to frame the narrative to help bring about that change. Everything that you said is just a really important takeaway and narrative and lesson for us to engage and implement. And thank you for your offer to continue working with us. And I absolutely am happy to talk to anyone and connect them with Professor Ocampo and through me and Amelia, if that's something you are interested in engaging in. So we'll have time for questions after, but we're going to go now to the next panelist, Professor Goldman, who will talk to us about the role of law in post-genocide and post-Holocaust recovery. I think you might have to hold the button.
Hello? Oh, there we go. I suppose the first thing I should answer is why a nice Jewish boy from Los Angeles came these thousands of miles to speak here. And the answer is that before most of you were born, about 35 years ago, I was sitting in my office at Loyola, and two of my students came in, one born in Armenia, one of Armenian ancestry, and said they wanted to start an Armenian law students organization at the law school, and there was nobody on the faculty. They needed a faculty advisor and a counselor in order to start the organization. Why, if I would agree to do it, because they had somehow learned, I didn't really talk about it back then, my family background, which I'll be discussing in a few minutes. And they asked if I would do it, and I did. And when I became faculty advisor, I went to the dean and said, you know, we really ought to be teaching a course at this school in law and genocide. I've been looking around the country. I don't really see any courses in law and genocide. And the dean said, we can't afford it. So I'd been teaching, I was already in my second decade as a law professor at that point. I'd been teaching quite a bit, and I went to some of my former students who'd been very successful, two of Armenian ancestry, one of Jewish Holocaust ancestry, and I asked them if they would fund it, and I was able to raise money. I put together the Center for the Study of Law and Genocide. I started teaching a course called Law and Genocide in 2009. What the center does is we run a clinic, which I used to run day-to-day operations. Tomorrow you will hear from Rajika Shah, who now is the director of the program. I still direct the center, but she runs the clinic. And the clinic, we do overflow work from the international tribunals, like the one you just heard about. They don't have enough workers. They don't have enough lawyers. So we have our law students, under the supervision of attorneys, do overflow work for them on questions of what is genocide. And I've narrowed the scope of the clinic to only those matters dealing with genocide. And also graduates of the clinic, I've put together a program where we provide them fellowships. So they get clerkships on international human rights courts, and we pay their salary for the few months that they are working there as legal advisors and assistants to help those tribunals. Which is why I ended up here and ended up writing somewhat about this area, even though my original scholarship was in the area of the confrontation clause in the hearsay rule. I've been fortunate enough to appear as counsel because of amicus briefs. Those are called friend of the court briefs that you file in America for courts. I've written a number of them dealing with both Holocaust cases and Armenian genocide cases. I've second chaired a case in American lawyers here will know it's an en banc of the Ninth Circuit on a question of insurance companies' failures to pay the descendants of victims of the Armenian massacres. And I've come here perhaps for a bit of a change of pace. By the way, the great prosecutor who was just on mentioned a few names that I'm familiar with the Eichmann trial. The very first Limkin Award I gave out was to Gabriel Bach, who was a prosecutor of Eichmann, died just a few months ago. And I went to his home in Jerusalem to try to persuade him to take it. He was too modest. He didn't want to do it. And I persuaded him to come to Los Angeles and accept the award. I did the same thing and gave the second award to Ben Ferencz. You watched the 92-year-old arguing, both when he was a 27-year-old. First trial, by the way, first time he'd ever spoken in a court was his opening statement in the case of 1 million murders. Ben had to talk them into he was a clerk basically there. He graduated Harvard Law. He landed at Normandy on D-Day. He'd fought through the Battle of the Bulge, and because he spoke German and was a lawyer already at 23, he ended up being a clerk kind of in the Nuremberg courts, discovered evidence of the murders of the Eisenstadt, and without calling one witness, he found so much documentation signed by the defendants that the entire prosecution case lasted 3 days, and the defense case lasted, I think, 8 months. And he received the convictions. I persuaded Ben Ferencz to come to Los Angeles and become the second recipient of the Limkin Award. By the way, Ben just in April had his 102nd birthday. Last time I visited Ben at his home, he began the morning the way he always does, with doing something you could guess 1 million times would never get, and that is 110 push-ups. Okay. And by the way, the motion picture, I used to teach film and law. It's sort of a subcategory specialty of mine, film and law, and I taught at the law school in terms of the depiction of law in motion pictures. And I was privileged enough to have as one of my guests the producer-director of Judgment at Nuremberg, Stanley Kramer, and that we spent a class talking with the students about the production of this film and what it was like. It was based on one of the later Nuremberg trials and was quite authentically close to it. But I would like to spend my last 15 minutes here. I wrote a book about my own, perhaps the reason why the students came to me and asked me if I'd be the advisor to the Armenian law students, a book I published only a couple of years ago, just in time for COVID to prevent me from going on a speaking tour about it, called Left to the Mercy of a Rude Stream. For those of you not versed in Shakespeare, this is a paraphrase from Shakespeare's alleged last play, Henry VIII. It deals with an individual caught in the currents of time and history and sort of unable to free themselves from it because they're being carried along by the movements of that current, of that flood. And I'd like to read to you a book a portion of the beginning of that book, which is, as you will see quickly, rather personal to me. And I hope this doesn't seem like too much of a change of pace, but when I'm done, I'll try to explain why I've done it. She was always cold, even in Los Angeles, blessed with its world-famous temperate climate. My mother still constantly complained of being chilly. Whenever people would ask, "Mrs. Goldman, it's so warm today. Why are you wearing a sweater?" she would respond, "I was cold for a very long time, and I never warmed up." With her accent, her old world, small town naivete, she did so often sound like the quintessential Jewish mother of an early 1950s television comedy that it was easy to think of her as some amusing stereotype. That is, unless you knew where she had been. In early 1942, Malka, my mother, was walking with her 7-year-old son, Archie, when a German officer stopped them. The soldier simply looked down at the handsome little boy and asked, "Was he a Yid?" My mother answered that he was. The officer put his hand on my half-brother's golden hair and remarked that it was a shanda, a shame. Only later would Malka understand that the German had likely known a truth that she and the other Jews of the Nazi barbed wire ghetto of Brzeźin were yet to learn, the fate awaiting the youngest amongst them. About 15 years later, when I myself was 7 or 8, my mother and I began boarding a crowded bus heading eastbound down Pico Boulevard in Los Angeles. As I got on just ahead of her, the harried and inattentive driver closed the door between the two of us and started to drive away, leaving my mother behind, screaming and running frantically down the street, pounding on the glass door until the bus stopped. She dragged me off and cryingly, uncontrollably spanked me until I cried from the pain. I was confused. Why was she punishing me for the busman's mistake? But even then I understood. She'd been frightened that I would be driven away, never to be seen by her again. What I didn't know at the time was that it had happened to her before. A few weeks after my mother's encounter with a German officer, the Nazis came and took her children, everyone's children, all the children too young to work. Archie and his 11-year-old sister, Genya, had been in bed when the soldiers ordered them to prepare to leave. The young ones, they said, were being taken to a village where they would be safe. The Jews were told that the transports were already full and they would be returning later for the parents. The adults cried and begged, but all pleas were rebuffed. The children were packed aboard trusses and delivered to a camp, centered in an unoccupied castle along the near river at Chełmno, about 35 miles northwest of Łódź. Attempting to remain detached so as not to feel the enormity of what she was about to say, my mother once described to me, and only once, the night my 7-year-old brother had perfectly dressed himself and was led away in the care of his slightly older sister. It was to be the last time my mother would ever hug either of them. She never saw her son again. Though Chełmno was a death camp from which no one seems to have emerged, my mother always maintained that in Auschwitz, she saw her daughter in the distance and shouted out the child's name. The child, hearing the name Genya, turned, looked back at my mother, tried to respond, but was pushed on by the guards quickly. If true, this would be the last time Malka would ever see her hear her daughter. She, like her younger brother, would be lost to a Holocaust that would take 1.5 million Jewish children. She seemed never to have lost the need to atone for having been left alive, when by any realistic estimate, she should have vanished with those whose faces haunted her. Nearly half a century had passed when she admitted to me that she had never been able to see a young child, particularly a boy, without feeling regret. The emotion had been with her even when she'd looked at me. It is a dark inheritance that for decades, when I look at a small child, I often cannot stop myself from thinking of the Nazis. While the memories of those events that make us happy too often fade away, those that break our hearts seem to unceasingly abide. And so, even in her later years, she never spoke of her dead children except to describe their partings, and I always lacked the courage and the cruelty to ask. I waited too long. The stories of their lives now lie only in a grave, and I must someday there, perhaps to learn them. There was, however, one other story she did tell me once about her first son. In 1937 or 38, my mother was journeying with a 3-year-old Archie to visit her sister who had moved to Belgium earlier in the decade. Knowing that they would be traveling through German territory, she'd brought her son a red ball. As the guards passed through the train compartment, she told him to look down at his new present and not to look up at the men. For good reason, she was frightened even then. It was a fear that would never entirely subside. Long after the Nazis had been subdued, the threat remained. Night terrors involving the shades of their former oppressors are common among survivors. And 60 years after she boarded that train to Belgium, my mother would often awake from nightmares, calling out to her caregiver, disoriented, glazed eyes. In a breathless attempt to focus, she would ask in a sheepishly and yet unsettlingly way, "Are there Gestapo?" And then, regardless of the time or day or night, she would call me. She was calling not because she was afraid for herself. Rather, she was checking to make certain that I was safe. Because there was no reason for the unforeseeable horror that had taken her first 2 children, she could never be convinced that it could not happen again. To her, the chaos of tragedy was ever lurking. even after I had grown into middle age. If she did not know where I was every night, she could be thrown into a panic. She once confessed to me that the only time she'd felt that I was truly safe were in those months just before I was born. Only then was she always sure I could be protected. I would be born to a generation of loss, and a small part of me would be forever caught in the currents of that rude stream that had nearly drowned my mother. Now, getting the stories down as quickly as possible of the victims of tragedies like any genocide is crucial. Soon after my father passed away when I was 11, my mother had the opportunity to collect reparations checks from Germany. But the amount of payment she would get was in part dependent on what she had lost. And having lost children, she would qualify for a higher payment. But she could not prove she'd lost her children. There were no records. There were no documentations taken. The history of the Jews had been destroyed. So many of them, their parents had been killed. When I started doing research on the book, I discovered that fully 2/3 of the children killed in the Holocaust cannot be documented. There was one woman who'd known my mother when she had her children in the small town she lived in, but she was too afraid to come forward and be a witness. She was afraid that the Germans might hold it against her if she gave testimony for someone else. So my mother was never able to collect that extra funds. Now you've got to understand, and I really want to make this clear, it wasn't a matter of needing the money. Yes, my mother as a single mother could have used the money, and by the time my mother passed away, she had used up all of her savings and was living solely on the reparations and my father's Social Security, but she had a son who was a tenured law professor and had a second full-time job as well, and therefore wasn't in particular need of the money. But there was another reason, and I think this reason deals with the importance of understanding recognition and acknowledgement and the feelings of the victims and their descendants. Let me read a portion near the end of my book that was a part of the beginning. Anger was part of what kept her alive. No matter how grave her condition, she was determined and determinedly said to me, "Don't worry, Stanley. I'm not going to give those damn Germans the chance to stop paying me my checks." And for years longer than the doctors had predicted, she held on. I don't think it was a coincidence that she passed away the morning after she had received and I deposited what proved to be the last of her monthly reparation checks. To some, the small payment made to the victims of by the German government may have seemed no better than meager conscience-easing blood money to be contemptuously spurned by any but the neediest. Yet for my mother, the arrival of each recompense was a small victory, and her continued survival to collect her last revenge. So I just want to emphasize that obtaining the voices of the victims and the documentation after any such mass tragedy is something that has to take place and has to take place quickly before the witnesses disappear, the documents destroyed, and there is no possibility of truly proving to the satisfaction of the perpetrators or others that these events have taken place.
Professor Goldman, thank you for the, first of all, beautiful testament to your mother and to her resilience and her strength, and to an incredible account of the importance of reparations, but also the importance of acknowledging the feelings of victims. And I think a common thread throughout all three of your discussions will be about the importance of victim narratives and how we can acknowledge and respect and appreciate the gravity of those in both legal work and also shaping narratives work to influence justice initiatives for atrocity crimes like this. So thank you so much for really the moving accounts from your book, and I'm going to look forward to reading it when I get back to the U.S. And now, last but not least, Professor Heckner, really tying in, I think, very well about witness accounts and genocide survivors. We are very much looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you so much. I should mention, so I'm Elke Heckner, and we've just recently launched at the University of Iowa a project in global memory studies, and needless to say, the Armenian genocide, but also the Artsakh war is going to be part of that. I already can assure you that. So I teach Holocaust and genocide studies, and one of the things I'm particularly interested in is how to, certainly with respect to the Armenian genocide, but also with the Holocaust, but especially the Armenian genocide, how to basically reanimate the history of the Armenian genocide in ways that are relatable to students. I teach at a Midwestern university where students very often have never heard that such a thing happened, right? Unlike California, a lot of states in the Midwest have no required Holocaust education. And so one of the things that I have been doing is drawing on a photo archive or certain kinds of video testimonies. One of the films we watch, there's this documentary on grandma's tattoos that discusses the tattooing of Armenian women, and then also talking about, for instance, well, okay, how does this compare to the tattooing during the Holocaust? How is it different? What kinds of tattoos can be claimed? Which tattoos cannot be reclaimed? You know, how does it relate to issues of rape? Rape is a war crime, and what makes it non-reclaimable? So I also work on issues of what's called second generation witnessing and or third generation witnessing. And this concerns the question of how folks who may not be, let's say, either Jewish or Armenian can relate to the trauma that victims or survivors of genocide have undergone. And this is very much in the interest of, you know, what Samantha Power would call a witnessing public. How do we manage to constitute a global witnessing public that cares, maybe even in times of COVID or post-pandemic, that takes on conflicts that in certain ways may not be relating to their own histories, but that they feel are very important human rights issues, right? So these are the questions that that I'm interested in. I would also really like to thank the Center for Truth and Justice for inviting me, especially Arsene, who we go back 12 years to the University of California, Berkeley, and Arsene was absolutely fabulous research assistant. I'm so delighted that she is now a lawyer. I also want to thank Haig for sharing 3 videos with me that I believe may be screened at some point during the conference, and there may be more. Let me just quickly go back to my talk. So I think what is of utmost importance is that these video testimonies by survivors and victims of war crimes and human rights abuses committed by Azerbaijan, and by implication the proxy nations such as Turkey that militarily supported their war and provided much of the drone warfare technology which terrorized civilian Armenian populations through incessant bombardments of civilian areas. I think it is very important for the world, or folks in Europe or the US and other states, to be listening to the embodied experiences of victims of and survivors, what it means to be subjected to the power and fear and terror of drone warfare. We may recall that the United Nations, for those of you who have been to the United Nations building in New York, it has a huge tapestry of the Guernica bombardment by the Nazis as the model of war crimes on the civilian populations. And I would want to argue that two of the testimonials that I looked at really provide incredibly visceral accounts of what it means to be hearing drones 8 kilometers away, what it means if the drones pass over the houses, bombard neighbors' houses into the ground, to see plumes of smoke, to see 10 drones being unleashed in the morning and in the evening, stuck for cover, send the children away, etc., etc. So I do think that these video testimonies hold incredible power for mobilizing something like a maybe global community of witnessing that still needs to be built in certain ways. But it is also the case that, for instance, especially in the US and Europe, there are scholars and activists, but also concerned citizens that have been really preoccupied with the asymmetrical power of drone warfare and its effects on civilians. And so I believe that some of these testimonies, and I really apologize, I had been wishing to pull up snippets from the interview, but that we don't seem to be able to do that, that these, some of these interviews speak so powerfully to the war crime aspect of unleashing drones on civilians. So one of the other, I'd like to say maybe a couple of words about the significance of first-hand video testimonies. Because in some sense, they not only document war crimes such as the bombardment of unarmed civilians and the human rights abuses for the purpose of evidence gathering, but they provide powerful accounts of the human cost of asymmetrical warfare. And it's really important in terms of genocide studies, awareness raising, to put a human face and a story told by survivors and victims in terms of both consciousness raising, but also constituting what I would call a witnessing public. So in a certain sense, you know, the public really needs to hear from, let's say, prisoners of war themselves about the systematic abuse they experienced, despite the Geneva Convention that prescribes the humane treatment of POWs. They also need to hear about the devastating impact of drone warfare on civilians, or the toxic effects of hate speech and state-sponsored violence and terror. And while, of course, these video testimonials are crucial for gathering evidences, they're also really important for what I would call the politics of representation. The question is, who defines the narrative of how the conflict between Azerbaijan and or the war will be represented, and what are the possibilities of cinematic or documentary representation. I should also mention that research has shown that it is the voices of victims, of narratives of defiance and survival, that make really a difference in what I would call in creating a larger witnessing public through media, educational institutions, and human rights advocacy groups. And I'm, of course, thinking mainly about here the US and the European reception. narrating the effects of war and genocidal conflicts through eyewitness accounts has been an effective strategy in making audiences care. I mean, that seems to be the main and primary, or one of the primary goals besides the prosecution. How do you engage a public that may know nothing about the conflict, but that may be open to issues such as tortures, human rights issues, issues to do with PTSD, and how do you connect them to the effects of war and the harrowing experiences that interviews share? Now, I should also mention, of course, and this is really, really important, it's not just, we don't just want to use survivors or victims' narratives as witness. It is very important that one also does justice to the mental and physical states of survivors and victims, and very often telling one's own story of what happened is a kind of validation and legitimation of their experience, but also can often promote a process of healing from the trauma that has been experienced. Now, I should say, needless to say, there is no question that it has been a challenge making international publics aware and care about the Artsakh War, which often has been considered a merely regional war, complicated by the widespread COVID-19 empathy fatigue. And nevertheless, I do believe that the video testimonies collected by the CFTJ speak to a set of important issues that have preoccupied a good number of concerned citizens in the US and Europe, that have received considerable attention in academia, namely issues of abuse, torture, POWs, asymmetrical drone warfare, and its devastating effects on vulnerable civilians, to just name a few. So I do think one of the ways to basically mobilize interest and support is to take these issues and connect them with the testimonies. Thus, an archive of witness testimonies on the Artsakh War is especially important, as this war has often remained invisible, as has been mentioned in the US and Western mediascape for various complicated reasons, but it nevertheless has the potential to alert larger segments of the public and global human rights community to the hate-driven expulsion of Armenians from Artsakh, or the complication of their lives, the torture of the POWs, the drone warfare on civilians, which has exposed the unholy alliance of a new kind of proxy warfare that draws on mercenaries and the military technology of, and this is a kind of like really shameful moment, of the NATO member country Turkey, right? In other words, I do believe that there is a strong potential to help create on multiple levels involving human rights organizations, education, academia, journalism, a global witnessing public that cares about the Artsakh War and the region, that could play an important role in how the war and its aftermath is represented in media and scholarship. And I would agree. I mean, at this point, since the war is over, it is absolutely significant to capture the narrative, define its representation, and then share maybe testimonies potentially with educational institutions. Now, I do want to maybe talk about very briefly about three testimonies. One is by a POW, and I'm just going to name him Jason. Jason was in captivity as a POW for 10 months, and we see he's in his 20s. When we look at him, he has a scar in his face. He is clearly, visibly, psychologically traumatized. He appears vulnerable. And what is very interesting during this interview is that he talks about the possibility of hope and how he felt hope looking up at the sky, the fact that there still was a sky, although in the we don't learn in the interview that he actually was subject to torture, beatings, systematic abuse. So that is not mentioned in this true snippet of the testimony, which is in one take, which I watched. But what is absolutely crucial is that there is this unspoken silence of not being able to articulate in that segment the horrific experiences he has been through. And it's almost as though he's trying to heal himself by focusing on this moment of hope. I should also mention, in the context of the Holocaust, very often survivors of concentration camps have also precisely made this reference to the fact that, well, they were able to see maybe the sky or the landscape, and that this was a really important moment. So I think when we watch these video testimonies, it's also very important to pay attention to what is not being said, to the body language, to the tone. All of these interviews are very structured in terms of answer and response. The other thing that becomes very clear at the end of the interview, and this goes to the issue of when one is tortured, it's not over with the moment of captivity, but PTSD, traumatic nightmares, stay with the body. It's an embodied experience. And so certainly at the end of the interview, one very much gets the sense that hopefully Jason and other POWs will get the kind of medical care they will need to resume their lives. What I really also liked about the interviews is that there is a question about the future, which Jason wholeheartedly embraced. And I think this is a fabulous way to try to move on, but at the same time, we need to be aware of the complicated steps it takes to move on and the medical care needed. So maybe just a couple of, how many minutes do I have? Five more minutes. A couple of more words about the two other interviews, and I'm just going to call the two other testimonies. I'm going to give them the names of Mary and Michael. So these are two civilians from Metz Maastricht who Mary is, I would say, in her 40s, Michael is in his 50s. Both describe a period of peaceful coexistence with Azerbaijanis in their villages, where, yes, there may have been tensions, but they were good friends, good neighbors. And then a series of conflicts evolved, very often to do with maybe village life, a tractor that couldn't be repaired. So Mary goes into details talking about how an Armenian villager was trying to repair a tractor. It couldn't be fixed, or maybe it wasn't fixed. Then there was an altercation where an Azerbaijani hit the Armenian with a wrench on the head. It's not clear what exactly happened, but it seemed that this set in motion an entire ethnic war. But I think what is very important is to also focus on this. There was a period of coexistence that clearly has waned. The Mary in particular will talk about the Sumkate massacres in '88, in which 32 Armenians were killed in this pogrom, and how that basically also set a tone for the kind of ethnic violence and altercations that were to follow. But then I should mention what is really most striking is a description of the embodied experience of drone warfare. What it means to be hearing the drones 8 kilometers before they land, the incessant clicking and So like the red beam laser lights that terrorize the civilian populations, and the kind of defenselessness. There is a notion of utter and complete helplessness, that where the civilians are completely exposed to the drone warfare and basically just have to see what the fate is. This, of course, also raises the question, who is operating the drones? We all know, the cubicle warriors that are the drone operators. For them, deaths are sort of like bug splatters on a screen. There is no visualization of death or destruction. And this also raises the question of, well, complicity, Turkey as a NATO member, and ought there to be some kind of accountability. I see that my 1 minute is up, but I'd be happy to talk more about this. So I do want to make a pitch for the significance of listening to the testimonials, or potentially, extracting a couple of minutes on certain subjects. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much to all three of you. This was really impactful and inspiring for both the genocide 100 years ago and also for the Artsakh conflict today. And we touched on all of that in your presentation, so thank you. We have many questions here that we will go through. We have about 20 minutes. I just want to let people know that at the end of this, there will be, thank you, student volunteers who will be directing you towards lunch. And also on Professor Heckner's last point to the importance of victim testimonies, we will have 7 sample videos of transcribed interviews that CFTJ has collected on the screens outside that you can watch at any point during the conference in the hallway. And so now for questions. The first question actually is a combination of someone else's and mine. And so in your own ways, all three of you talked about the importance of survivor accounts to shape narrative, access justice, and mobilize a global community of witnesses, like you had said, Professor Heckner. So testimony is clearly the basis of so much of our work, both in human rights advocacy, in legal avenues and mechanisms. And here with CFTJ, we have many students who either have survived the war themselves or were living in Armenia and living through the war also in proximity. And I'm curious to each of you what advice you might have to the students that collect these testimonies or guidance for them. I know, Professor Ocampo, we've talked about, and you've emphasized a lot, the importance of the youth in these movements. And Professor Goldman, you just spoke about the importance, by reading your mother's testimony, of her narrative and her words. And Professor Heckner, you spoke to the same in building this kind of empathy and mobilizing people through firsthand accounts and hearing from the people who survived. So all that is to say, the students who we have at CFTJ doing this, what advice might you have for them, Professor Heckner? How do you build that community of witnesses through using their stories that they're willing to share with us?
Mm-hmm. Do you want to go ahead? Or?
No, you should.
Okay. All right. So I think it would be really important to mobilize all media of artistic expressions that are out there, and that involves theater, screenwriting, film, documentaries. In terms of video production, I could see a montage or an accumulation of a documentary, and I understand there is already a documentary that's being produced. I think I'd also encourage, working with U.S. law schools and I think educational institutions. I will, as of next semester, integrate, if I'm allowed, some of this material into my classes. I think it would also be really fantastic if students, especially if they are maybe eyewitnesses themselves, are invited to the classroom to speak to students or law students about their experience. So I'm happy to talk to you afterwards, but I think there's just multiple ways in which students can both learn but also become engaged.
Well, I think perhaps USC is the best place for someone from USC to talk about this, because they have a Shoah project there. They have they take the testimonials of people who are still alive, sometimes in 3D, I'm told. Actually, when I put a program on a few years ago, I was able, through the Shoah Foundation, to get a gentleman who was about 103, who had survived the atrocities in Armenia when he was a child of about 5. And we got, he only was at that point in his life only speaking Armenian. There, he had spoken English for a while in his life apparently, and then had reverted back only to Armenian. So we got an interpreter through USC at Loyola. We had him come and speak. He was the last surviving male that we were aware of who had survived. And 3 weeks later, he passed away. So we got his last words about it in public, about what it was like, even as a small child, to live through genocide, in Armenia. It's one of probably, I've put on more than a dozen programs since I started this in 2009, and that was amongst the most moving things I've ever heard. This little man describing what it was like as a child.
And Professor Ocampo, for you, media, you spoke to the great importance of media, both for Nuremberg and also in Argentina, to help prompt the justice processes and to help shape that narrative. But now media is constantly evolving. And so how do you see the new mechanisms, maybe like TikTok or other things, playing into these conversations? Should we work to utilize these platforms? And if so, how? You're muted still. I think you have to unmute, Professor.
I think it's very important what my colleagues in the panel say about the power of the victim testimony. Plus, I believe also we should also focus on the rationale of the leaders and the bureaucracies, not just those who are involved in the crimes, but also others. President Obama was a great president and very committed. However, he had problems to mention the word genocide in Armenia, or he decided not to investigate, not to push for the arrest warrant for genocide against Bashir, because he has other priorities. So I believe narratives are not just about the victims, also about the perpetrators and the other governments, because that is, we need to understand, the global legal system is not homogeneous. There's no one constitution. Different countries have different ideas. So we need to understand that. And media is crucial for that. Not just newspapers, films. I believe we have to adjust to new generation, to TikTok. Look, Kim Kardashian could be the most valuable asset you have in Armenia, no? She got 350 million followers. Come on. She can really help you to mobilize a transformation of this conversation. So we need to learn on that. But of course, she would talk about other issues, but 5% could be about the Armenian genocide. Or we could do something with her about courses or teach. So I think Armenian in diaspora are very powerful. In fact, I didn't mention, but the president of the court that prosecute the generals in my country is Carlos Arlanian, an Armenian descendant of the genocide. So Armenians are everywhere. And we have to just develop narratives using different tools to be together and work together to transform the situation and help.
So thank you. And tying into that, particularly about maybe including and engaging perpetrators, and this can be for you or for anyone, but it seems that many current conflicts are defined by they're long-running stalemates or the guilty regime emerging victorious. And so there are extra challenges to bringing this narrative forward. And so we're curious to know from any of you what extra challenges occur when attempting to collect testimony from victims in these scenarios or to share their narratives in a public forum, and also not just victims, but perpetrators who have emerged victorious. And how do you engage with that and get around both that and the lack of empathy or empathy fatigue that we heard about earlier too? Professor Ocampo, really the first question maybe is to you about how do you get around making a public narrative that is impactful and persuasive and heard by many when the perpetrating regime was the one that emerged victorious?
Well, victories sometimes are not lasting. When I prosecute President Bashir, he was very powerful, the president, and no one touched him. But today he's in jail. So when I prosecute Muammar Gaddafi, he was a global leader. He was indicted and then he was killed. So in political life, victory is not permanent, no? And that's why the victims, Brazilian victims, push. At the end, they got justice. So none of this doing justice for this conflict or transforming the narrative is not a short-term goal. It's a long-term goal that includes decades and includes many constituencies. Let me give you an example from the 19th century. In the international legal system adopted to end the traffic slave. That was obviously a crime against humanity. And it started with the law in UK promoted by the UK government with the Quakers. The Quakers were influenced because they have 2 or 3 members of the parliament who were Quakers. And the government need the votes, and they push for a law to prohibit to the owner of plantations in the British colonies to traffic slaves. And the law was adopted, and then the British owners of slaves in the colonies decided to, instead to oppose the law was adopted. They had now transformed the game, because if not, the French colonies will have advantage of them. If they cannot have slaves, the French should not have slaves. So therefore, the support for make this law international treaty came from the most unexpected group, the owner of slaves in the British Empire. And then there were many battles, many big issues. Sometimes UK had to use its own army to impose, discussion in US because of the Civil War. But at the end, it took 60 years, but the process ended with the global decision to prohibit the traffic slave. So that's a good example of how, yes, there is not something you can solve in one day, and you will need many actors involved, including people that you believe could not be part of that. That's why something I believe strongly, we cannot just work with Armenians. I think Professor Goldman explained clearly the connection between the Armenian genocide and the Holocaust. And then you have Rwanda, and there are many. Yes, there are peculiarities of each case. There are particularities that we should take it. But the concept is we should understand we have a global view, particularities, and also involve even people who normally would be against. I suggest, Anoush, that you should engage with Turkish students. Check what Turkish students are thinking. Azerbaijan, what's happening in Azerbaijan today. So engage and connect, understand all those who are involved in these problems. We should be comprehensive. So that is my comment. In order to transform, we need time. We need to be coalition. and it's about law, it's education, it's about political power, it's about everything. And we need to learn how to combine all these elements. That is my answer to you.
I would like to say, I'd like to emphasize something you said when you were speaking, that where you teach people had no idea. I don't think we always realize what a small minority we are who are aware of these events taking place. In America, it's true, the educational level at the secondary level and even at college has become so basic and minimal that they just don't seem to spend time learning anything about events in history in the world. And the number of people who don't understand that these events took place are astonishing. We're really talking about the most basic knowledge that they lack, that even that these events occurred. They were casting for an Anne Frank play in Los Angeles, and they wanted an entirely Hispanic cast for it. It was being directed by someone who was Jewish, but he wanted it for an entirely Hispanic cast and people of Hispanic ancestry. And he told me that during the auditions, not one single actor he auditioned knew who Anne Frank was. They knew there was this play, and that was the title of it, and they showed up. And it's the basics of education. Unless you happen to grow up with it as part of your, environment, your history of family, you don't realize how little the rest of the world understands. Maybe people you deal with every day. That might be a place to simply start. You mention it to people you work with who are not of the same ancestry as you, and therefore might not have learned about it as children, because the educational system is not apparently doing much of a job in teaching it unless there's affirmative action on the part of those of us who care about it to get the information out there.
Just to the question of perpetrators, and do we really need to hear perpetrator voices at this point? I feel very uncomfortable with the question of giving a microphone to perpetrators who have already completely twisted and tweaked and propagandized the narrative at this point where harm and continued harm is being done. I think it is too risky to involve voices of perpetrators who would very likely just, repeat the same narratives they've used to start the war. So I stay away from them. And one of the things that I'm always reminded of is in the Claude Lanzmann show when he interviews one of the Nazi engineers, Franz Suchemel, who constructed the concentration camps and films him with a secret camera. So this guy goes on about the great engineering feat of the concentration camp system, completely unrepenting, completely unsympathetic, and falling back into Nazi rhetoric, right? I mean, no, these are not positions that need to be reaffirmed. What we really need to do is support the victims, survivors, get the story out, and, make an intervention and, mobilize more people around this.
Thank you. Thank you all so much. It is now noon, so I think that concludes our panel. Thank you very much.